how do you all balance this idea of trying to achieve an intermediate or short-term goal by virtue of an electoral outcome to so much of the sentiment that exists out there that maybe it just doesn't even matter, my vote doesn't matter, all of the different things that go into the subversive messaging that has seeped into so many of our, how do you pull people up out of that mindset, push them towards an immediate goal with the understanding that, have faith, there's a long-term goal that can still be achieved? Angela, do you mind kicking us off?
Yeah, it's actually something I've been thinking about a lot. When you do year-round organizing, you hear everything.
But
And
Angela, see, you have an advantage. There's an election like every 3 hours in Wisconsin, so
that's true. That's true.
you can
It's
cheat a little bit.
rarely like our next election is in February, right? Like there's
Right.
November and then there's February. Like we don't get a break here. And that's also why it's important for us to have some sort of year-round presence. The longest stretch we typically had was from April of last year to February of this year. That's the longest stretch that we typically have. But you hear everything. And what I often tell people is that there are sometimes we find ourselves having three separate conversations. One, we want to turn a non-voter into a voter. I hear every single time. I try, COVID outside, but normally I would try to be on doors at least knock doors for every election cycle. I try to get on doors myself as much as possible. And it never fails. I always hear myself, even on election day, "Here, are you voting? Your polling place is down the street. You want me to walk with you?" And they're like, "No, like I voted before, nothing's changed. Like, what does it matter?" And so we need to acknowledge that the system has failed people. And I always try to challenge and push back when people try to shame people for not voting. There are reasons why people don't vote, and we shouldn't shame people for that. We should just do our best to meet them where they're at and bring them along. People need to see the reason that their votes matter. Even just recently over the summer, I happened to be talking to a woman, and she's telling me all the ways that society, the government has failed her. Heartbreaking story, trauma and abuse. And I said, "So are you voting in November?" And she said, "No. My priority and my focus is to make sure that I'm taking care of my child. No one's going to look out for us. No one has. That's my main priority." I was like, okay. So I flipped it. I was like, well, would you be interested in telling your story to the mayor and all the things you think the city should be doing better? She's like, absolutely. Tell me when and where. And so she wasn't opposed to civic engagement as a whole. We need to reframe civic engagement as more than just voting. And our goal is to start as an entryway. And that's why we need to have a year-round conversation, because if we're having, three separate conversations and the first one starts with turning a non-voter into a voter, the second one is having people understand the roles and responsibilities of the offices they're voting for. Instead of saying, hey, just vote for the state Supreme Court candidate that I'm telling you about. Do you know about what the state Supreme Court does? Do you know that they're 10-year terms? Do you know that high profile cases such as X, Y, and Z have all happened, have impacted you? And this is the candidate that we're supporting. Those are three separate conversations. You have that political education, and then you want people to support your own candidates. And that's not something that can happen now, right? Like there's a reason why we've been having these conversations on a year-round basis, because people need to know, one, the agency that they have within themselves, and also how the political system works. Everyone has an opinion. We notice that everyone has thoughts and feelings of what should change, but people don't know how to interject and make those interventions in a system that wasn't designed for us to participate in. So we need to be patient and have these conversations early and often as possible.
I'm seeing nodding heads, and I don't know which one of you, April or Tristan, feels up to following that, but I'll leave it to you all to decide.
Well,
go ahead, Tristan.
I'll jump in just to endorse all of that. I think Angela's exactly right. She's spot on. The key is to create a culture of participation. That means to identify entry points beyond voting. We say, we have a saying in our woke vote work, I think Rubik's, we say voting is a comma, not a period, right? Voting is just one form of the entire democratic and civic engagement process. We should expand people's understanding about what civic participation looks like, so that we can engage folks. And I mean, to answer your question directly, Tamara, what do we say to the disaffected voter? To Angela's point, there are so many legitimate reasons for why it's been made difficult. Access to the franchise isn't voter suppression is expansive. Let's just put it that way, right? There's so many ways that folks' ability to vote is suppressed, and a lot of it has to do with, you know, the economic conditions that folks live in. But on a recent podcast, DeJuan and I both were speaking about what those challenges were, and frankly, you know, I'm grateful for that voter who says, "Why should I vote?" It really does give us a chance to stay sharp and to really, you know, understand what's the case and to keep ourselves grounded and rooted in community. Again, the swing voter is taking someone who's historically a non-voter or less likely, the so-called low propensity voter, and invest in an experience that they can value so that they participate. And that is sort of what we wake up, you know, and do every single day. It's what we train and our organizers to focus on. And one of the things that we've learned that helps us find success is that this is not about candidate A or candidate B. This is actually about the lived experience of the person we're engaging. And when we center that lived experience from an equitable standpoint, we're able to prioritize that person's needs. To Angela's point, you know, the young lady was interested in sharing her story and her opinions, but needed an entry point to understand where does that value, where should I assign that value? And voting is just but one form, right? So I think you're able to make the case, all right, well, vote and that's sort of the idea we have to have when it comes to folks who have been disaffected. First, to understand that, you know, legitimately disaffected, disenfranchised, and really understand what that means. That is not a lack of will or desire. That is, there are actual impedences. There are things in the way of participation that have been constructed intentionally in a lot of ways, which is just awful. And we're working against that, number one. Two, to really center their lived experience so that they can actually see value in the process that, you know, that they've been shut out of for a long time, all of us. So I think that I would just follow up as best I can with, you know, we should treat a lot of these folks are essential workers, right? We're coming out of COVID. We should treat them as essential voters as well. And what would that look like? Well, it would mean to invest in a real experience, civic participation, where we're finding entry points that value their lived experience so that they can exercise their right.
April, before you chime in, let me offer you just a little bit of a wrinkle, because these are obviously outstanding answers and they're nuanced. I'm not throwing a curveball at you, I promise. We're hearing a lot in this thread about community. We're hearing a lot in this thread about consistency and depth of relationship, which to me leads to trust. So if you could just talk about the value, like keep the original question, but also, because you guys established trust, that's a major component of this within community, because we're of the community. Could you speak a little bit about that and how you get to that point so that you can follow through and then have folks focus on what their intermediate goals may be and how it leads to longevity?
Well, you know, we call the organization Black Voters Matter and not Black Votes Matter. And the part of that is because every time someone says our organization, they're reaffirming that I matter, right? And so if people are wearing Black Voters Matter shirts, if they're saying Black Voters Matter, they're not talking about an organization, they're talking about themselves. And so one of the first things we don't do, and to help build trust, is we let the local folk do what they do, and we fight to get resources to them to do what they do. In other words, I'm not trying to build a chapter of Black Voters Matter in a small community. What I'm trying to do are find the people that are doing the work in that community and ask them, what do they need? What is your agenda? Because one of the things I don't assume is that lack of quote unquote output in an election means that that community does not have people who are doing and valuing and working to bring about change in their communities, right? So I believe, regardless of what the voter outcome is, we firmly believe that somebody in that community, organizations and people care about what's happening. What they've decided is that voting is not as effective as some other means. And so part of what we do is find those people, and they're there, whether it's pastors at churches, whether there are city council people in one lowly district, whether there are just civic organizations in a community, whether they're workers who at some point had to organize at their job. There are people who are finding ways to bring change. So we look for those change makers. And when we find those change makers, we ask them a very simple question. What is it that you need? And we honor our word and our involvement, which is we want to get you the resources for that. Do you need a voice? Do you need money? Do you need t-shirts? Do you need size? Do you need vans? Do you need data? What do you need? And we give that to them to do what they do best. If they need more expertise to understand how to use things like Van, we find a vehicle to do it. If they want to lift their voice through texting, we try to provide it. In other words, we are a part of their team. And so in being a part of the team, as opposed to saying, this is what our agenda is, and we want you to come in, helps to build that trust. And so the connection between building trust, as well as what we do to get people to say, I don't want to vote, and I do now want to vote, is one, understanding, as it's already been said so brilliantly, right, that there are more ways for you to participate and change your community, right? Civic participation or just changing your community. And we have to adopt that and believe that. Voting is important, but it's not been the premier form of change for people in this country. In fact, through protest came the Voting Rights Act in 1965. We didn't vote that on a ballot, right? We had to protest for that. And so protest and boycotting really has been the preeminent or revered form of organizing for our community. So we almost trust that more than we do voting. And when we tried to get voting, what we wanted to do as a people, right, was to find a way to strengthen. We thought that in voting, we could find a way to strengthen our ability to bring in policy. So years of seeing the ineffectiveness of that, we continue to do what has been effective. And I will say this, the most recent protest in this summer, where we're talking about police brutality and things of that nature, that's not on a ballot, but yet you're seeing communities making changes. And so what we do, and let me bring it back to voting, right, is we show that just as you are demonstrating and protesting and you're making change, now what we can do is connect voting to making sure that those representatives follow the mandates that we're saying on the street. So you got to vote that sheriff in. You got to vote that mayor in, who's going to then appoint the chief of police. We got to vote a DA in. And so you make it scientific and you make it make sense so that all the good work you're doing already in your community, bringing change through those other mechanisms, this is how voting can complement and augment and continue the process of bringing power. It's got to make sense to folks. So it's not rocket science is what I'm trying to say. People do things that work. And so when voting begins to work for them, they will begin to participate more. People need to see that voting works just as much as protesting works, just as much as marching works, just as much as boycotting works. And when you have a community that can make that connection, you will not have to ask this question anymore. You will have a community that's ready to go in any election because they will see how it matters. So it's our job, right, to help communities continue to see how those two things work together, instead of just asking them to do it.